Attention all CDL drivers. Do you have what it takes to be a champion on the road? Kimball Recycling and Disposal is growing and looking for experienced CDL drivers to join their team. Kimball is offering a $5,000 sign-on bonus. That's right, up to $5,000 just for joining their winning team. At Kimball, they value your experience and offer a great work environment where you can thrive. It's time to gear up and drive towards a brighter future. Apply now at kimballcompanies.com. Kimball, recycling and disposal done right. Welcome to Talkin Trash, where we try to answer all your questions about recycling and proper waste disposal in Tuscarawas County. I'm your host, Hannah Hartman, and joining me is my go-to expert on all things recycling here in Tuscarawas County, my sister, Rachel Rodacher. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
Rachel is a passionate advocate for recycling and sustainable practices, and she has worked in our local recycling industry for several years. So her behind-the-scenes knowledge about how to recycle properly in Tuscarawas County is vast, and it is what will guide our ongoing discussions here on the Talkin Trash podcast. This episode is being recorded on October 8th, 2024, and because rules and regulations change over time, some of what we discuss may have changed by the time you hear this, but with that caveat, Rachel, let's dumpster dive into this discussion, okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, we always like to start with the basics. We assume that there are some people who may not have heard every episode of Talkin Trash, so they may have missed some of the basics in previous episodes. So can you quickly go over the basics?
Of course. I always like to say, give someone a high five for our 5 categories of typically recyclable materials. So that would include plastic bottles and jugs, metal cans, glass bottles and jars, cardboard, and paper products. That's the quick in a nutshell version.
That's right. High five. And, we, in the first 5 episodes, we did a deeper dive into each one of those. So you can always go back and listen to those if you missed them. But this time we wanted to start with a little bit of listener feedback and some follow up. So we did have a listener who let us know that I don't remember which episode it was, but one of the earlier episodes you were talking about how really when you think about recycling, it should actually kind of be the very last thing that ends up happening with whatever, item you're trying to recycle or get rid of, as opposed to the first thing.
Yes, right? We talk about the hierarchy. So if you imagine the pyramid, what's on the top, what's on the bottom. So if you think about it, recycling is not the top of the hierarchy. Really, you want to reduce waste in the first place. Right. You want to not produce it because then otherwise you don't have to worry about the inevitable waste you'll produce. So right. Reducing it, reusing it is better because then you're not having to reprocess it into another material. Recycling does come after that. But of course, the very bottom is, landfilling it. So,
So we appreciate that listener feedback, and we're glad that people are kind of taking to heart some of the information that we're offering here. So great. Love it. All right. This time, we always try to do different sections of the podcast. So our Where Does It Go section, we've already covered the 5 basics in previous episodes. So now we're moving on to a little bit of different territory, I guess you could say. And we want to talk about organics, or what you might refer to as like compostables.
Yes. So to start, I do want to tell people that these do not belong in your recycling bin, whether at your curb or at a public drop-off site. So these are kind of different than the first 5 things we talked about. But I do like to talk about them because it's a huge portion of the waste that ends up at landfills, and the huge portion that you create at your home as well. So when we talk about organics, we're really talking about things, as you would imagine, like it's organic material, food waste, yard waste, such as grass, leaves, branches, things like that. So that's usually what I hone in on, is like the food waste. I think of them as 2 separate categories as well, because food waste, you have to handle kind of in a different manner than you would with yard waste. Okay. There are some programs, like here in the city of Dover, we do have a yard waste drop-off site. They also have a curbside program for leaves. In addition, I believe you can call into the city. You might want to call and actually ask them this before you take my word for it. But they used to have a program where you could call in and they would come remove like branches and things like that as well. and other municipalities located in Tuscarawas County have similar programs, but you cannot take food waste to that yard waste drop-off. Okay. So even though you think of it as, oh, it's all compostable, why does it matter? It's all going to break down. It doesn't have to do with the fact that it's compostable. It's more because where is it going? So like, for example, the Dover yard waste site goes to a composting facility out in Dundee, Bull Country Compost, and it's not licensed to take food waste because there's different classes of composting facilities. So there's actually 4 different classes. I'm kind of looking at them here. And some of them, like pretty much all the 4 can take yard waste. That's the grass, the leaves, branches, small shrubs. Most of them won't take an entire tree, but if you cut it into portions, they might take it. That's the kind of thing they're looking for at any of these facilities. However, beyond that, you want to check and see what number class, if you're going to use one of these facilities, what number they are, because otherwise they can take agricultural waste and animal waste. Class 2 ones, which are higher up, they can take the food waste. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a class 2 in Tuscarawas County, but there is one up in Stark County. There is one in Wayne County. So the reason I bring this to your attention is just so that, well, one, don't contaminate. We'll use that word. Contaminate the yard waste drop off or, your leaves at your curb by dumping food waste in there, because that's not where that stuff's going to go. It's
essentially the same thing as contaminating your recyclables with trash, right?
Exactly, because it's not what they want at those places.
And if they end up throwing out a whole, truckload of something because of that contamination, then we've done ourselves no favors, right?
Exactly. So that's kind of the reason I separated into like the yard waste materials and then the food waste materials. So when we're talking about food waste organics this episode, I'm talking more about, unless you're going to transport this to one of these class 2 facilities in another county, I'm talking about composting in your backyard.
Okay. Yeah. And really, if you don't have a garden or you don't have just, I guess, a spot for composting, I hate to discourage it, but there's not a lot of point if you don't have somewhere to put that compostable. Like, even if you think, well, I don't want to, I can't recycle it. Maybe you don't want to throw it away, but if you really don't have a place to put that compost once it's composted, I don't know, maybe you have a neighbor or somebody you could give it to.
Maybe, or I go back to the hierarchy. What food waste can you reduce in the first place? Now, of course, you can't do that with things like eggshells or coffee grounds, but I like to be creative sometimes. Like, let's say I use broccoli florets, but then I have all the stalks because I don't like eating the stalks, but then I make slaw out of the stalks. Or like, it's kind of a silly thing to think about, but it's an example of how you can at least avoid some of the food waste.
It's like a parallel to recyclable materials, So that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So, and to dive a little deeper into the food waste too, and I think we're going to get more into this, but I'll state that if you're looking to do your own home compost pile, there's so much information on the internet. There's guides for how to set it up. But generally, you want to think about like green items that'll go in it and what they deem brown items that'll go in it. And you want a 1-to-3 ratio. So for every 1 part of green materials, which would include actual like vegetable scraps, fruits, flowers, eggshells, things like that, you want 3 more parts of brown materials, which would include things like the yard waste, the dead leaves, twigs, even cardboard or shredded paper. We've talked about shredded paper before. You really don't want that in your recycle bin, but you could use it in your compost. So just something to think about when it comes to the ratio and what all really could go in your compost.
I have to make a confession here because I do compost. I do have a garden, but I'm really bad about getting that, like really trying to get that ratio. I'm like, it's probably maybe 1-to-3. I don't know. So I should probably put a little more effort into trying to get that ratio right.
And it depends on what your intention is. Like if you actually want to use this on your garden and you want to make sure it's not too rich in nitrogen or it's just the right amounts of nitrogen or, carbon or whatever, you could study this more. But I will say that if you have a compost pile that's already started and you're just adding to it, the ratio does change a little because you're not starting from scratch. So like if you have, you're adding just some veggies to an existing compost pile, it's going to get broken down.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I should probably do better, but it's good we're talking about this. Is it okay if I move on to our next section? Or do you have more to say? Okay. So now we'll go into the common questions section of the podcast. So since we're talking about compost, I think a common question for a lot of people, I remember it was one I had when I first started doing this. Should you include animal-based scraps in your compost. I'm thinking meat scraps, fat, even bones. We'll get to that, but should you?
I would say it depends, as I say a lot on this show, but I would say generally no, I would not throw them in there, primarily because anything like meat-based or just fatty, think fish, fatty foods, meat and dairy products, other than eggshells themselves. They will attract flies and rodents potentially. You might get huge, ugly maggots, as I found when I put a pizza box in mine that had grease on it. And that was an unfortunate surprise that day. Also, it creates more odor. So if you do live in town, at least, and I'm sure there's ordinances about, you don't want it to be considered open dumping. So luckily, I know Hannah and I know the type of compost we have, and it's a rolling bin. It's pretty enclosed, so they're not generally smelly. But when I walk around our neighborhood, I can see a few people that have like an open top one. So you definitely wouldn't want to put meat in something like that. The other comment I'll make that's kind of related to this is that certain things you may think could go in a compost would actually propagate harmful bacteria that you definitely wouldn't want in, or otherwise they would, it would ruin your compost if you do plan to use it for composting purposes. So things like that people might think, oh, maybe I could put my, cat or dog poop in there because that's better than throwing it in the landfill, right? But there's bacteria that's in cat feces that you don't want to be with your tomatoes. So imagine that. Yeah. Also, you wouldn't want to put like diseased plants or plants that are weeds. Now, I will say that weeds, theoretically, if your compost gets hot enough, then it should kill the actual seeds of weeds so that you shouldn't have weeds in there. But it's a little bit of science to it. So if you're just doing a home one and just kind of experimenting, I would just say steer clear of stuff like that. Otherwise, you're probably going to spread more disease and weeds, and you don't want that.
It basically depends on how much time and effort you want to put into composting. You could really, like you said, learn the science of it, get the ratio right, avoid putting this or that. But if you're kind of like me and you're like, I just kind of want to like not throw this stuff in the trash and do something with it, again, I should probably be doing a better job of trying to strike that ratio and whatever. But going back to the cat feces, like you think, oh, fertilizer, but it's not
the same
really,
as cow manure. Yeah, and that's been at least processed. Although that is what's funny, because I know that, again, that local compost place in Dundee, they started the compost place because they have cows. And so they were like, we have all this manure. What else can we do to make a product out of it? And that's kind of what led to them becoming a compost facility.
Interesting. All right. Anything else on that particular topic, Rachel?
No,
okay.
Nope.
Well, then let's go into our dumpster diving section. So I found something in the dumpster and fits the theme here, compostable utensils. And we'll just add to that packaging, right? Compostable packaging. So I found it's like a fork that says that it is compostable.
Primeware brand.
Yeah. Compostable contents and wrapper is what it says on it. Okay. But I found it in the dumpster, so it's
the recycle bin.
The recycling dumpster. So it's not going to get composted in there, for one.
Yes, and not recycled. Those are not recyclable.
Yeah, really shouldn't have been in there. Yeah. But let's talk about, again, I go back to the fact that this podcast is about specifically Tuscarawas County. Yes. So if I were to... I guess I can't put that in the yard waste, like that's...
They actually, it would depend. You would want to work with the local person. Actually, even though they are not registered to take food waste at any of these class 3 or 4 facilities, which are the only type located in Tuscarawas County, they actually usually, like if you have clean, non-food contaminated serviceware is what I would call it. So plates, cups, or forks, like that's not prohibited from their EPA license. So technically, if you do have a bunch of those, they could theoretically take them. However, I will say it's not the best idea. Like that would be a very specific situation where maybe you have a pallet of these you were supposed to use and then you can't use them for an event or something, and I would take it directly to them. I wouldn't just go throw it at Dover's site, because usually if you dump stuff in a site and people see it, they're going to think, oh my God, that's, I'm going to bring more of that. And maybe they don't realize it's compostable. Yeah. And plus, even the people at the Dover Yard Waste site might be like, that's not, they don't want to have to go picking through to take the stuff out. So,
well, okay. So you're making me think. Let me take you back to your wedding day, Rachel. You had compostable plates and serving utensils and all this kind of stuff at your reception.
Yes.
So what ended up happening with all of that?
Well, I'm hopeful that it did compost, but I will say this was before I knew all this. So this was, 12 years ago. So, and the actual yard waste site wasn't even located where it is now. So way different time, but I should not have taken that stuff to that drop-off site. I didn't realize I couldn't because, again, that's why it's good we're having this podcast because here I saw it's a compost drop-off. So in my mind, compostables go there. So one, I shouldn't have taken it there. Two, they weren't really licensed to take it because there was so much food mixed in. Like we literally, when we had extra salad, we just like dumped it in there and took it. So theoretically, if it had been like clean, nice plates with very little food and stuff, they probably did. Now, in actuality, I doubt they saw it in time to take it out. So it probably did get broken down. So I guess I feel okay about that, but I shouldn't have done it. So
okay. So, but then again, larger picture, what good does it do for your average person who wants to do the right thing and they think, okay, well, I'll get some compostable plates. And like what you're saying is, well, if it's clean and doesn't have food residue, then okay, maybe it can be composted. But if it does have food residue, doesn't that defeat the purpose of having the compostable? Well, it is
funny. It is a good point you bring up because one of the only reasons I tell, like if a business, some of the local businesses will have these compostable serviceware. Now, I will say some of like the almost cardboard looking, if it's like a paperboard, you can rip it. It tears easy. That actually probably will break down in a home compost pile. Okay. But the thing we're holding up from your dumpster diving looks like plastic. It's a kind of organic, you can't, if I broke it, you'd hear it snap. I'm not going to break it. But so that's not going to break down. Or the things that look like plastic cups, those, I've tested it. They won't break down in my home compost. It doesn't get hot enough. It doesn't have the same levels of oxygen, water, heat, everything going on that an industrial composting facility would.
So for your real go-getter out there in Tuscarawas County who is determined to make sure their compostable utensils and stuff end up where they really should end up, they would have to leave Tuscarawas County?
If they had these specific, what looks like plastics is what it is. So, but I will say, there still is some good in purchasing things that are marketed as compostable, as long as you don't feel you're being greenwashed, which is a word from another. Go listen to our other podcast to learn what that means. But you are at least supporting companies that care enough to create these things. And some of the time they are ending up where they need to be and you can home compost them and things like that. So I wouldn't say never support a company that offers compostable because it's never being composted. It's not the full, as with anything we discuss on here, not the full picture.
And again, I go back to every municipality does things differently when it comes to recycling and composting. So just because it can't work here necessarily doesn't mean that it's not working somewhere else.
Well, exactly. And honestly, with these things, that it's better than plastic. I mean, even if it ultimately ends up in the landfill because you don't want to transport it and it won't break down in your home compost, it will at least break down faster and break down into organic components, even if buried. So it's, nothing perfect.
A little bit of hope there. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to our What's the Word section. And this time, Rachel, we're going to talk about zero waste.
And I love that you put the emphasis there, Hannah, because we've discussed it before this, so you know where I'm going with it. But really, the definition I found, there's many different, so depending on where you want to get it. But the definition that made me laugh, and that's from the US EPA, was that it's diverting 90% of operational waste from landfill. So I'm not even sure where the zero comes from. But I mean, I guess they're recognizing that there is a portion of the waste stream that can't be avoided. Like, think of things like hazardous waste. You can't. So there's no other way for it to be.
Yeah. So it's like if you take that stuff and take it out, then we're at zero waste with everything else.
Kind of,
but not exactly. But kind of.
So that's why I think zero waste is funny. So if you see you'll see universities saying, oh, we're going zero waste. Just remember, it doesn't usually mean 100% waste free. And it's not only that they're getting recyclable material. Sometimes it's a combination of things. So maybe if it's a university and their food services program, they might be composting that. They might have an anaerobic digester or something, an in-vessel composter there at the university that breaks down their waste. But then also the serviceware itself, maybe it is recyclable because they're working with a processor who can take it. So it might be a combination of things.
Well, I think this is a good opportunity to jump in and say, I think you and I were big dreamers with big ideas, and as we've learned more about how the world actually works, it can be a little depressing to think about the challenges that we face when it comes to waste and recycling and composting and all of that stuff. But I don't want people to just give up entirely on these ideas and just get all plastic stuff and throw it all in the trash, and because why bother, right? Like,
yes, I think you can't change the world, but you can make a dent. To quote a movie, Death to Smoochie that we love.
That is one of my favorite quotes. Okay, so zero waste is a bit of a misnomer, but I would like to think that anybody who is maybe putting on a zero waste event or whatever is definitely doing something right.
Correct.
Even if it's not technically zero waste, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, from there, let's go to our simple solutions section. And this is a simple one, I would say.
Yes. And this actually goes back to the hierarchy as well. So my simple solution that's related to organics is mulch your grass. Don't bag it. Because again, I'll go back to it. Many municipalities, but not all, but some of them do have a leaf pickup program. And oftentimes they do transport the leaves to a composting facility and they get composted. However, if you bag your grass, that's not going to get it's in the bag. They're not going to rip open the bag, take that to a compost facility. So if you bag it and throw it away, it's not going to get composted. However, it's very good for your lawn to just mulch the grass and leave it. So unless you have a really high, like you just let the grass go, or you have some field that's not your lawn or something, unless you're dealing with something like that, don't bag it. Just leave it on the lawn for the health of the lawn. Okay. So, I mean, it's a simple thing, but it's the reduce the waste in the first place. Now, I will say there is a ban, this sounds wild, but there is a ban in Ohio from dumping loads of yard waste at a landfill. And it is a ban to save landfill space. And you might say, how is that even possible? How it's possible is that if there's any trash commingled into the yard waste, they can dump it at the landfill. So the reason they can throw away your dumped grass is that there's a bag around it. And often they put it in the trash truck. They're not keeping it separate. But if you were to drive up to Kimball with your truck bed filled with leaves, they turn you away unless you throw a spoon in the back or something. I don't know if there's a threshold of trash, but it is something worth noting that they did pass this legislation years ago to try to preserve landfill space. And because, again, a huge portion, I'd have to look it up in my notes, but there's a huge portion of yard waste. I think there was 2 times as much yard waste as all other recyclable commodities combined or something like that. You need to fact check me, but it's like there's so much and it is perfectly recyclable as compost.
Right.
So,
well, and it takes me back to our last episode or one of the last episodes when we were talking about paper products and how much of that could be diverted from the landfill. So if we're trying to preserve landfill space for actual trash, there's so much that's being thrown in there that really shouldn't be or doesn't need to be.
Yeah, and I'd rather the landfill not be the highest point in my county. So,
okay, that's maybe a topic for another day. Another simple solution, and this is one I do at my home. I have a countertop compost bucket. Now, I do also have the rolling compost bin outside. So the compost bucket that sits on my countertop, it's one of those ones, it's like metal and it's got what is that called? That filter to filter the smell. And it's just like a temporary small bucket that takes a couple days worth of compostable materials before I empty it into the larger bin outside. But they're easy to find and super handy. And I put all of my coffee grounds and my eggshells and my orange peels and banana peels and everything in there. And I feel better about it because it's not going in the trash.
Yeah, so. And I think that's a great solution. Another one I've heard some others, I think one of our other sisters, she'll freeze compost until she can take it to where she's taking it. So there's a lot of ways you can do it. But I don't want people to be discouraged by the thought of having, rotting food in their house. And, it's going to attract fruit flies or whatever. So many different kinds of bins and solutions to avoid that.
Yeah,
so.
That's what the filter is for. Yeah. All right, Rachel, we've added a new news section to the podcast. Okay, we're calling it Junk in the Trunk.
I love it.
And the idea is that you tend to carry all kinds of random stuff around in the trunk of your car for different reasons. And so the junk can change from day to day or week to week. So what kind of junk did you find in the trunk here recently?
Well, this one, again, by the time this podcast airs, this won't be quite as relevant. Okay. But initially, the one I had was this whole stack of egg cartons and syrup bottles.
Yeah.
And we were kind of discussing this. I need to look this up to check. But the reason I carry them is because I've been getting my eggs and my syrup from the farmer's market. So again, when this airs, the farmer's market won't be in season anymore. But the vendors at the farmer's market have always been willing to take back the things. I don't believe it's a health code violation as long as there's an interesting law about this. I mean, it doesn't apply to farmers markets, I think, as much as like typical stores. But like there are some local places where you can take in your own cup. That's a good example. Beverages. You can take in your own coffee cup, for example, or smoothies or things like that. You can bring in a container. The reason you're allowed to do that, and it's not against the health code, is because those containers were designed by that company or for the purpose of refilling. So it is interesting. I don't want to get too into the weeds of it in this episode, but there is a standard wherein you can have, I think it's called the refillable returnables or something. Mm-hmm. Maybe I've flip-flopped them, but you can actually bring them in. And as long as there's not the opportunity for your thing from your house to contaminate the work surface at the place, then you can bring it in. But there's some strictness. You have to be able to ensure things. They have to be able to visually inspect it, make sure it looks clean. They have to be able to rinse it with water real quick to make sure it's disinfected so they don't get you sick handing it back to you. Luckily, the egg cartons and syrup bottles, we're talking very small potatoes. These aren't big companies like Starbucks or something like that taking them back. But if you have an egg that broke and it got, egg all over it. No, I would compost that. That's a perfect thing for compost if it's a cardboard
paper,
one. Yeah. Not styrofoam. Yeah. So that being said, cartons are permitted to be reused as long as it's by a smaller farm. And they have to have all the non-pertinent information taken off of them. So let's say whoever the original farm was, they have to remove the original producer because that's not going to be relevant anymore, or any other information. But they do have to keep the safe handling statement on the carton. So if you see that on there, you don't have to take that off or anything if you're going to donate them. Also, the reused cartons should be in sound condition. So not, a couple of the things ripped off or something. And they have to be free from any visible dirt, at least.
Okay, so that's the junk you found.
That was the junk I found in my trunk. I had lots more, but we picked those two for this one.
Okay. Well, and that'll take us to our final section, the good news. We like to end on good news. And so we have a sister who lives in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And there's all kinds of interesting things happening up there. But she had clued us into a reusable takeout container program. And so she had sent us a link. I opened it up and I was like, wow, this is super cool. What did you learn when you looked into it, Rachel?
Well, it's a relatively new program for the city of Kalamazoo. I think they're more in the stages of piloting it to see how it's going to work. However, I kind of looked around, and the company that they're partnering with, it's called Foreverware, but there are several of them throughout the country, and they work in different cities. Like this Foreverware also exists. It looks like it's mostly in like Chicago, Minneapolis. Now they're piloting in Kalamazoo and somewhere over in Boston, I think. But there were different ones. Like California is really big into this. They have a lot different laws than we have here in Ohio. And so they have some laws in place in certain counties in California that say like you can't produce single-use plastics, and you're like it. As you can imagine, the companies were up in arms about it, and they have laxer standards about being able to bring in your own containers. So even though we were just talking about like the health code, that was Ohio's health code. They've changed things in California, but it is interesting to me because basically the concept is it's not like a single-use plastic. It's actually a container that you can bring back in. It's like a more rigid plastic, or I think there were like metal cups for the drinks and like metal, for the food. But you bring them in and they wash it on site there with their normal dishes they're creating. So it's not like you're bringing in your reusable smoothie cup or whatever. You're taking something that's going to stay there and they're going to clean. And kind of the model of it is that you pay a deposit, like a $5 deposit or something, just to even use the cup. But then once you have the deposit, you can keep using that. It's not like you're going to always pay $5 every time you rent it out. As long as you continue to shop at those restaurants, that deposit's going to be used every time you go somewhere different. So unless you're eating out every single night, and then maybe you need 50 of these containers, but usually you're not going to do that many.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. I love this idea. I can see why it would be a bit of a Herculean task to implement it. But I think as the world continues on and plastics continue to accumulate in landfills and everywhere, maybe people will embrace it a little bit more. And I don't know. I think it would be really interesting.
Yeah,
I'd be all for it, is what I'm trying to say.
And this program specifically, I don't think it's limited by where you live. Like if we had enough people interested in this community, it's like you just have to be able to convince the restaurant itself to spend the initial investment, which didn't look to be that much, I'd think, in the grand. I know.
Okay.
Wheels turning.
We're going to start rubbing elbows with some restaurateurs around here, maybe.
Because basically it's like it wouldn't be that much extra work. I mean, a little extra for them in the restaurant side because they're going to be washing the dishes. But from like the consumer side, you basically like scan a QR code to rent the thing or show that you're returning the thing.
Okay.
So it didn't seem like that much extra work, but I didn't do it myself. So.
Okay. The wheels are turning, Rachel.
Yes.
All right. Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap this up?
No, but yeah, if you have more questions about the organics, the yard waste, the food waste, again, so many resources online.
Oh, yeah. And you can always email your questions to us. So that's
we'll do the research for you.
There you go. So that's going to do it for this episode. We hope we've offered a little more clarity about how to recycle properly in Tuscarawas County. But like I said, if you have questions you'd like us to address on the podcast, email them to WJER@WJER.com, and we'll do our very best to get answers and offer explanations to help you understand the process better, because when we know better, we do better. I'm Hannah Hartman.
And I'm Rachel Rodacher.
And we'll talk more trash on the next episode of Talkin Trash.